In 1897, Comitan de Domínguez in Chiapas, Mexico, was a town of cobblestone streets, whitewashed walls, and a slow, deliberate rhythm of life. It was a place where people greeted each other in the plaza, where gossip traveled faster than any newspaper, and where everyone knew everyone, or at least thought they did. Yet behind that facade of neighborly warmth lay a darker truth. Comitan was also a town that knew how to keep its secrets. The story of the Pineda family's well is not written in any official records. No schoolbook teaches it, no plaque commemorates it, and no historian dares to publish it without altering names. But for those who grew up in Comitan, especially the elders who still remember, it is a tale whispered only in kitchens late at night when the children are asleep. Because it was not just a scandal, it was a wound that never healed. The Pinedas were not outsiders. They were a prominent family in town, respected for their wealth and feared for their influence. Their patriarch, Don Manuel Pineda, owned vast lands on the outskirts, and his name carried weight in every political meeting. On Sundays, the family occupied the front pew of the church, dressed in their finest. To the world, they were pillars of society. But behind the high adobe walls of their estate, something far more sinister was happening. Rumors had begun years before. People spoke of workers who disappeared after disputes over wages, of drifters who came into town and were never seen again, of strange noises coming from the Pineda property after midnight. In a small community like Comitan, such whispers could easily spiral into myths, yet these were not tales that came from nowhere. They came from farmhands, from neighboring ranchers, and from the occasional child who swore they had seen something being dragged across the courtyard under a black tarp. But here was the problem: nobody wanted to confront the Pinedas. To accuse them openly was to risk not only one's reputation but also one's livelihood. Don Manuel's reach was long. He had friends in the mayor's office, in the police, and even among the church elders. The townspeople learned a simple truth: it was safer to say nothing. Silence was survival. That silence became a kind of pact. The baker who delivered bread to the Pineda household stopped asking why the servants looked pale and withdrawn. The cobbler who mended Don Manuel's boots ignored the dark stains on the leather. Even the priest, who heard strange confessions in the dim light of the confessional booth, gave only vague sermons about sin without naming names. The truth was like a poison. Everyone knew it was there, but no one wanted to drink from that cup. Then came the well. The Pineda's estate had a deep stone well, supposedly built generations ago for fresh water. Children in the town whispered that it was bottomless, that it connected to underground rivers, that voices could be heard if one leaned over the edge on moonless nights. In truth, it was no ordinary well. Farmhands who worked the Pineda land said that it was always kept locked, covered with a heavy wooden lid and iron chain. And yet every so often, a wagon would arrive in the dead of night, no horseshoes clanging, wheels wrapped in cloth to muffle sound, and something would be lowered into that well. Over time, too many people went missing for the well to be dismissed as a superstition. But the town had learned its lesson. It was easier to look away. Life went on. Market days were still bustling, fiestas were still celebrated, and the Pinedas still smiled politely in public. It is easy from a distance to condemn that silence as cowardice. But for the people of Comitan in 1897, speaking up meant more than risking one's own life. It meant endangering family, friends, and even entire neighborhoods. Fear has a way of twisting morality until silence feels like the only choice. Yet even in the face of fear, there were those who remembered not to spread gossip, but to ensure the truth was never entirely buried. Old women kept the memory alive through hushed warnings to their grandchildren: stay away from the Pineda land, and if you ever hear a voice calling from a well, do not answer. The lesson is simple but profound. Evil often survives not because of its strength, but because of the silence of those around it. Comitan's well became a symbol, a reminder that truth, no matter how dangerous, must one day be spoken. History may have buried the Pinedas in polite forgetfulness, but in the hearts of those who remember, the well still waits in the shadows, heavy with secrets and the weight of unspoken justice. And so, the story remains not to frighten, but to teach. Because every community, no matter how peaceful it seems, has its own well of silence. The question is whether we have the courage to speak before it swallows more than we can bear. The Pineda family of Comitan, in the closing years of the 19th century, stood as a symbol of wealth, refinement, and opportunity. Their sprawling estate, framed by lush gardens and rolling fields, was more than a home. It was a statement of influence. Generations of trade in coffee, textiles, and precious stones had filled their coffers, granting them access to things most could only dream of: imported furniture from Europe, silk garments from Asia, and a constant flow of fine wines and spices from distant shores. But prosperity in a small town is never just about money, it's about perception. The Pinedas understood this deeply. Every Sunday they occupied the front pews of the grand church, their clothes perfectly pressed, their jewelry catching the light like a silent proclamation of their status. They sponsored town festivals, funded local schools, and made generous donations to public works, ensuring their name was etched into the memory of the community. Yet, behind every act of charity was a calculated move to preserve their influence. The patriarch, Don Hilario Pineda, was a man both admired and feared. Known for his sharp business sense and unyielding resolve, he had a reputation for never losing a negotiation. His word was law in Comitan's trading circles, and those who crossed him often found themselves without work or means. The Pineda estate became a place of whispers. Servants spoke of meetings held late at night, of locked rooms, of strange deliveries arriving in covered wagons. But such talk never left the walls of the estate. Loyalty, after all, was bought and paid for. To the townspeople, the Pinedas were untouchable. Their wealth had woven a shield of respect and silence. Their prosperity, however, was not built solely on honest labor. The family had mastered the art of controlling supply routes and manipulating prices, ensuring that small competitors were swallowed whole or forced into submission. Every transaction in Comitan's bustling markets somehow led back to the Pinedas. The town's economic heartbeat was synced to theirs. It was this iron grip over the town's fortunes that created both admiration and resentment. Many envied their riches, but none dared challenge them openly. Those who tried, merchants, landowners, even political figures, found themselves mysteriously bankrupt, shunned, or gone altogether. Whether by bad luck or deliberate design, no one could say for certain. In this era of their greatest prosperity, the seeds of the family's eventual infamy were quietly taking root. Power had brought them not only wealth, but the belief that they were above the law, beyond consequence. And in a place where the Pinedas controlled both the economy and the narrative, who would dare tell a different story? For years, the Pineda family's dominance in Comitan felt like a law of nature, unchallenged, unquestioned, and unshakable. But in the summer of 1897, a single incident began to fracture the illusion they had so carefully built. It started quietly, almost unremarkably, with the sudden disappearance of a young man named Mateo Hernandez. Mateo was not just another face in the crowd. He was the son of a modest merchant who had once been in Don Hilario Pineda's good graces. Bright and ambitious, Mateo was known for his charm and sharp mind, traits that earned him a small but growing role in the town's trade scene. He often spoke of wanting to break free from the shadow of the Pinedas' monopoly, a dream that many admired but few dared to pursue openly. One evening, after attending a small gathering at the Pineda estate, a gathering he had been surprisingly invited to, Mateo vanished. Witnesses recalled seeing him leave the property just after dusk, heading down the cobblestone road toward the town square. He never arrived. By morning, whispers began to ripple through Comitan. Where had he gone? Why had he not returned home? At first, the Pinedas feigned concern. Don Hilario himself visited the Hernandez family, offering his deepest sympathies and promising to use his influence to find the young man. But behind closed doors, servants whispered of heated conversations in the estate's inner rooms, of strange noises in the dead of night, and of a sealed well on the far edge of the Pineda property that no one was allowed near. The town's local authorities, many of whom owed their positions to the Pinedas, were sluggish in their investigation. Officially, they suggested that Mateo may have left for the capital in search of work, or become lost in the surrounding countryside. Unofficially, people were less certain. Mateo's family insisted he had no plans to leave Comitan, and his belongings, money, and documents remained untouched in his home. Days turned into weeks, and suspicion grew. A traveling peddler claimed to have seen a young man matching Mateo's description being forced into a covered cart near the Pineda estate. Another villager swore they had heard desperate cries echoing from the direction of the old well during the night of Mateo's disappearance. But fear kept these accounts from becoming official statements. In Comitan, accusing the Pinedas was dangerous. It was only when a second disappearance occurred, a young maid from the outskirts of town, that the atmosphere began to shift. The maid, Elena, was last seen delivering a parcel to the Pineda household. Like Mateo, she vanished without a trace. This time, the pattern was harder to ignore. 2 disappearances, both linked in some way to the Pinedas, could not be dismissed as coincidence. Small acts of defiance began to surface. Anonymous notes appeared in the market warning townspeople to stay away from the well. Rumors spread about the family's past, dredging up half-forgotten tales of business rivals who had vanished years earlier. While the Pinedas tried to project an image of calm control, their smiles seemed tighter, their presence in public more calculated. The turning point came when a group of local farmers, tired of the growing fear, decided to investigate the well themselves. They waited until midnight when the estate was quiet and approached the overgrown path leading to it. What they found was chilling, a heavy wooden cover bound with chains and a foul odor seeping from beneath it. Though they dared not open it fully, what little they saw was enough to confirm their worst fears. Someone had been hidden there. Word spread quickly, though no one dared confront the Pinedas directly. Instead, a quiet rebellion began. Merchants stopped trading exclusively with the family. Parents forbade their children from working on the estate. And though no official charges were ever brought against them, the Pinedas' hold on the town began to loosen. The disappearance of Mateo Hernandez had cracked open a door that could never be shut again. What had once been whispered in corners was now spoken in hushed tones in the marketplace and over kitchen tables. The Pinedas were no longer untouchable. Their wealth and influence had shielded them for decades, but now suspicion gnawed at their legacy. In the years that followed, Mateo's fate remained officially unsolved, and the well was quietly destroyed under the pretext of modernization. But in Comitan's collective memory, the truth lingered. The disappearance had been the first thread pulled from a tightly woven tapestry, and as it unraveled, it revealed what the town had long suspected, that power without accountability breeds darkness, and that even the mightiest families can be brought low by the weight of their own secrets. The town of Comitan was no stranger to whispers, but on the night of October 12, 1897, those whispers swelled into a roar that would never quite fade. The moon hid behind a thick curtain of clouds, leaving the cobblestone streets swathed in an eerie darkness. It was a night without stars, as though the heavens themselves refused to bear witness. Yet one thing pierced the blackness, the sudden glow of lanterns. They began appearing slowly, one by one, bobbing along the streets like ghostly fireflies. At first they seemed harmless, neighbors checking on one another, perhaps a late night errand, but there was a strange coordination to them. Each lantern was held high, moving not aimlessly, but toward a single point, the sprawling property of the Pineda family. Inside the estate, the Pinedas were having dinner. No music, no celebration, just the quiet clinking of silverware on porcelain. But as the orange glow began pooling against the walls, as the shadows of figures began stretching across the windows, they knew something was wrong. The family had always been respected, or feared, depending on who you asked. They had wealth, influence, and a strange immunity from the law. But that night, it seemed neither their money nor their name would protect them. The first sound came like a crack in the air, a single stone hitting one of the Pineda windows, then another and another. By the time the third shattered pane fell in glittering pieces to the floor, lanterns surrounded the house completely. The crowd, at least 40 strong, stood in silence, their faces half lit in the glow, their eyes fixed not on each other, but on the house itself. From somewhere within the crowd, an old woman stepped forward. Her voice, raspy but fierce, cut through the air. "We know what lies in your well." Gasps rippled through the gathering. Some glanced at her in shock, others in approval. The words were dangerous. For years, rumors had swirled that the deep stone well behind the Pineda home held more than water, that it was the grave for those who had crossed the family, or simply gone missing in mysterious circumstances. Every town had its boogeyman, but here, the Pinedas were both the myth and the reality. Tadio Pineda, the patriarch, stepped out onto the balcony. He was calm, too calm. Dressed in his tailored black coat, he looked more like a man addressing an audience than a mob. "Go home," he said evenly. "You have nothing to fear here." But fear wasn't the problem anymore, it was anger. The disappearance of Rosa Mejia, a young seamstress, had been the final spark. People whispered that her voice had last been heard crying near the Pineda property. The authorities had done nothing, and so the people had come themselves. Someone in the crowd shouted, "Show us the well." Another voice echoed it, then another. The chant grew louder until it was a unified demand. But the Pinedas refused. That was when the first lantern hit the ground. Oil splashed, flames licking upward. It wasn't aimed at the house, but at the garden, toward the back, where the well stood hidden behind high hedges. A wave of urgency swept through the crowd, and several men pushed forward. The Pinedas guards tried to block them, but they were outnumbered. The fight was quick but brutal. Shouts, the clanging of metal, and the crash of more windows breaking. Finally, a group reached the back garden. With hands trembling from adrenaline, they pushed aside the tangled vines covering the old well. The stone was cold, slick with moss, and then came the smell. It was a stench so thick and foul that even the bravest stepped back. Someone held a lantern over the opening, and the light flickered down into the blackness. What it revealed was not clear, only shapes unrecognizable, yet undeniably human. The cries that followed were not of victory but of horror. The crowd did not linger. Some ran to the church to pray, others to their homes to lock the doors, but a few stayed, keeping their lanterns lit until dawn, as though afraid the darkness would swallow them next. The Pinedas disappeared from sight that night, slipping away through a side gate. By morning, their home was empty, the well sealed with heavy stones, as if nothing had ever happened. Yet the people of Comitan knew the truth. They would not speak of it openly. Fear still lingered like smoke in the air, but they remembered. Every October, on nights when the moon hid and the streets were silent, they would light lanterns and set them at their doorsteps, a silent reminder that justice sometimes comes not through courts or laws, but through the courage of those willing to face the darkness head-on. The night of the lanterns was not just about vengeance. It was about breaking the silence. It was about ordinary people, long ignored and long afraid, finally standing together. And though the well was buried, the memory remained, a lesson that truth, no matter how deep it's hidden, will eventually demand to be seen. Comitan awoke one morning to an eerie silence that seemed to settle over the streets like a heavy fog. The night before, whispers had spread like wildfire. Something had happened at the Pineda estate. People spoke of strange movements under the cover of darkness, of wagons that came and went without sound, of shadowy figures loading what looked like heavy, shrouded bundles. But by sunrise the great house stood still, its windows shuttered, its doors locked. The Pinedas, once the most visible family in the region, were simply gone. There was no farewell, no announcement, no legal notice of departure. It was as if they had been erased from the town in a single stroke. Their land remained, but their presence, the chatter of their servants in the market, the sound of horses in their courtyard, the light of their lanterns at night had vanished. At first, people thought it was a temporary absence. Perhaps they had traveled to the capital for business or taken refuge in another city. But days turned into weeks and weeks into months, and still no sign of them returned. Inquiries sent to nearby towns yielded no answers. No Pineda had been seen on the main roads, in the trading ports, or in the estates of their extended family. Then came the discovery that sealed the mystery and deepened the fear. A group of laborers hired by the local authorities to inspect the Pineda property ventured into the back garden. There, half hidden by overgrown shrubs, was the old stone well the family had built decades earlier. It was sealed shut, but the stones bore dark stains that no rain had washed away. Someone whispered that the smell was wrong, not the damp, earthy scent of groundwater, but something heavier, sour, and metallic. When the well was finally unsealed, the truth was more terrible than anyone could have imagined. Inside were remains not of one person, but many, bones upon bones, tangled together, some so old they crumbled at a touch, others disturbingly fresh. The horror was unspeakable. The authorities tried to count, but the task was overwhelming. Rumors claimed the number was over 20. Some bodies showed signs of violence, others bore traces of poison. The identities of the victims became impossible to confirm. The townspeople recoiled in shock. How could such crimes have happened under their noses? The Pinedas were supposed to be the pride of Comitan, patrons of the church, generous employers, people who shook hands in public with priests and governors. Yet here was a well full of the dead, buried not in the open earth, but hidden in the water that had once given life to their home. What followed was stranger still. A team was dispatched from the state capital to investigate, but within days, orders came from higher up. The case was closed. The remains were buried in a mass grave, the well sealed again, and official records made no mention of the incident. It was as if someone in power had decided that the Pineda name and their disgrace must be erased for good. Soon, even speaking about it became dangerous. Neighbors who had seen or heard suspicious things were visited by men in dark suits and told to keep silent for the good of the town. The few who refused found their shops burned or their livestock poisoned. Comitan learned quickly that silence was the safest choice. Over time, the younger generation grew up with only fragments of the truth. The old Pineda estate was eventually sold to a distant cousin who renovated it, painting over the cracks, planting flowers where weeds had grown. The well remained sealed, a circle of stone that children were warned never to touch. But for the elders who had lived through it, the memory never faded. They spoke of it only in whispers, usually after a few too many drinks, their eyes darting to make sure no one was listening. For them, the vanishing from history was not just about the disappearance of a family. It was about the way power can manipulate truth, the way entire chapters of reality can be torn out of the book and burned, leaving only the faint smell of smoke. And yet, there was a lesson in it, one that still resonates in the hearts of those who remember. Evil thrives in silence. The people of Comitan had turned away from their suspicions for years, choosing comfort over confrontation, gossip over action. By the time the truth was too large to ignore, the damage was already done. Lives had been lost, justice had been buried, and history had been rewritten by those who held the pen. Today, that sealed well stands not just as a relic of a dark past, but as a warning. No matter how powerful the figure, no matter how untouchable they seem, corruption festers when it is allowed to hide in the shadows, and the cost of silence is always paid in human lives. Years passed, and the events surrounding the Pinedas faded into whispers and half-remembered tales. The old adobe houses of Comitan began to crumble, replaced by newer structures. Children who once ran past the Pineda estate now grew into adults who no longer remembered the fear their parents felt. And yet, for those who had lived through the shadow of that well, the lesson remained etched into their souls like an unhealed scar. The authorities had tried to erase the incident from official records. The Pineda name was quietly removed from ledgers, their property transferred through convoluted legal channels, and the house eventually left to rot. But erasure from paper did not mean erasure from memory. The townspeople, those who had seen the nights of lanterns, those who had heard the muffled cries before the silence, carried their stories like a warning carved in bone. Old Dona Mariella, who had been just a young girl when the disappearances began, often sat by her doorway, telling her grandchildren, "People with too much power and no conscience will use both to dig their own graves, and sometimes the graves of others." She would not speak the Pineda name aloud, but everyone knew who she meant. Over time, the Pineda's Macabre well became less a physical place and more a symbol, a reminder of what greed, arrogance, and moral decay could do to even the most respected families. The town never forgot that the Pinedas had once been admired, their wealth envied, their connections unshakable. And yet, in the end, their name was remembered not for their fortune, but for the horror they left behind. Those who studied the family's story saw a deeper truth. Evil rarely begins with one large act, it starts in small compromises. For the Pindas, it had begun with exploitation, then silence when wrong was done, and finally, the complete abandonment of human decency. And because the town had allowed itself to be blinded by the Pindas' influence, no one dared to confront them until it was too late. The elders warned the younger generation, "Do not be dazzled by silver and gold. A beautiful house can have a rotten foundation. Look deeper, always look deeper." What lingered longest in the memory of Comitan was not just the cruelty of the crimes, but the community's complicity in letting them happen. That realization stung. It was a bitter truth, one that forced people to reflect on their own moral courage. In the decades that followed, whenever a wealthy or powerful figure began to rise in the region, someone would inevitably say, "Remember the Pindas." And yet, human nature being what it is, the lesson was often at risk of fading. New generations wanted to believe that times had changed, that such darkness could never return. But a few wise voices continued to speak, ensuring the warning would not die. Teachers told the story in hushed tones, priests worked it into sermons about justice and humility, and old men at the cantina would nod knowingly when talk of corruption arose. By the 1930s, the Pineda estate was gone demolished by a family from the capital who wanted the land for a new home. But the well remained. They filled it with earth and stones, planted a garden over it. But locals swore you could still hear the wind whistle strangely over that spot, like a sigh escaping from deep below. Some avoided the place entirely, crossing the street rather than pass the gate. Others left offerings, candles, flowers, small wooden crosses. Whether out of superstition or respect for the dead, no one knew for sure. The well had become more than an artifact. It was a moral landmark, a quiet but unshakable reminder that truth can be buried, but it will never disappear entirely. The people of Comitan learned to measure wealth differently after the Pineda tragedy. True prosperity, they began to say, was not in the size of your land or the glitter of your possessions, but in the way you treated those with less. Many families who once dreamed of marrying into money began teaching their children to marry into kindness instead. And so, even though the official history never mentioned the Pindas, even though the archives remained silent, the story lived on in the streets, in the kitchens, in the plazas, because some truths, no matter how much they are hidden, refuse to die. The lesson of the Pindas was simple, but it was carved deep into the conscience of the town. Power without morality will always collapse, and when it does, it will take everything, and everyone down with it. That was the gift the tragedy left behind. Not wealth, not pride, not fear, but a truth strong enough to outlast stone walls and forgotten graves.